Welcome. This is TR Live, episode number 7. I'm your host, Brent, and I've got the usual panel here with me, John, Jeff, and William S. Lind.
Cheers.
How's everyone?
Good.
Good and getting better as the wine goes down in the glass.
Of course. I don't really have any housekeeping issues tonight, so we can just jump right into it. The first bit of news that I wanted us to talk about was that it was either today or yesterday. It was announced that Trump will not be withdrawing from Syria. John Bolton has said that there will be conditions on the withdrawal. There will be no U.S. troops or U.S. forces removed unless Turkey agrees not to attack the Kurds when we leave.
Well, here we see what we've seen so often with the Trump administration. The president is being sandbagged and sabotaged by his own staff. As I said several weeks ago on this show, the president's move to get out of Syria is exactly right, because we don't want to be there if the Turks go after the Kurds. Now, there's been a new development there, and it's largely a result of the president's decision to get out. It's a very positive result. The Kurds turned to the Syrian government and said, we want to ally with you, and we want you to come back and incorporate the Kurdish areas in northern Syria into the Syrian state, move Syrian armed forces in. That will probably forestall a Turkish attack into those areas, because what the Turks don't want is an autonomous or independent Kurdistan on their border. And then they wouldn't have that. It would just be the Syrian border as it was before. So, of course, the establishment in Washington, including Bolton, right in the president's own White House, are doing their utmost to keep our troops in Syria, which will just get us caught between various warring parties, and which contributes only to ISIS and the other fourth-generation elements that are trying to destroy the Syrian state. It's both tragic and it's almost incomprehensible how the president allows his own staff to publicly undermine everything he does.
I gotta say, this goes into my general opinion of Trump as president so far. He's just such a roller coaster. It seems like, yeah, he's got the right instincts, but he never really goes all the way on them. He just, when he does act, it seems like it's like whatever the last person he talked to told him to do.
There is definitely some of that, but his instincts, again, on policy, not on personnel choices, are generally correct. And they're certainly correct in terms of getting out of Syria, getting out of Afghanistan, indeed getting out of the whole region, and returning to traditional American policy, which is that we defend ourselves, but we don't go around the world looking for monsters to destroy. His instincts are right on that, but he simply doesn't seem to know what to do when his own people undermine and negate what he has correctly decided. It's a lack of steadiness, a lack of seriousness. I don't know exactly what to call it. But very clearly, in any previous administration, if you'd seen the national security director undermine the president's policy that way, his head would have been on a pike, politically at least, outside the White House the next day. It's extraordinary to me that Trump allows this.
We've got Ethnarch in the live chat. Glad to see you're watching. He says, Trump won't allow Bolton to undermine him on this. Bolton was trying to assuage the Israelis. Kushner wanted to reassure the Israelis, hence the Bolton nonsense. Trump won't let that stand.
I guess we'll see. I know that Trump was on his way to Camp David today. I imagine there might be something developing there as far as negotiations with Israel. But yeah, I mean, there's so many things behind the scenes that Trump has had to do based on the existing structure, I think, because he's been such an outlier candidate. Presidents in the past, they were put in place by the powers that be, and they allowed him to be president this time around. How much control he's had over his picks, I'm not really 100% sure. Should he have 100% control over his picks? Absolutely. As the commander-in-chief, he should. But he's up against so many things within the apparatus of the deep state, within the powers that be that have had their careers made in the last 7 years, Bolton being principally one of the many few that are there. We'll see what shakes out as far as the next couple of weeks, but a lot of this must too be the deep state kind of meandering their way into discussions with this kind of stuff.
Well, of course it is.
Yeah.
That's exactly the problem. But he's allowing the deep state to take over his own White House. Now, yes, the Israeli connection is definitely a factor here, but the Israelis, from my information, have figured out that they're better having states on their borders than non-state elements like Hezbollah. I mean, the number one threat to Israel at this point is no foreign state, not even Iran. It's Hezbollah and Hamas, fourth-generation organizations. And it's very much in Israel's interest to see the Assad state, the Syrian state, restored. So
Definitely.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to me for the Israelis to be trying to say we should keep our piddling number of troops in there who really only serve to try to protect the Kurds from the Turks, which in the end they're not going to be able to do. I.e., if the Turks come in there, we're just going to get caught in the middle. We'll be the ham in the sandwich.
Well, it's definitely not what Trump wants to happen, for sure.
No. So again, I think part of the problem is he simply doesn't know where to turn to get serious, competent people who are not members of the deep state.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, it's tough to find them.
It's very difficult.
If they're not tough, I mean, we're all right here. He can just call us, right?
All he needs to do is move the capital to Cleveland.
Jeff, you had a couple items that you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, from this past week, there was an article in the New York Times about the Army's problem with recruiting. And apparently this year, they're about 6,500 recruits short of their goals. And the article I read is that they're now turning to non-conservative places, liberal places like Seattle, San Francisco to draw recruits from. And the pitch that they're giving now isn't so much, hey, come serve your country, blow stuff up, drive tanks, fly helicopters. It's, still get money for college. But now it's becoming like, hey, if you don't know what you want to do with your life, take a couple gap years in the military, and then we'll pay for your college, travel, see the world. So the Army, especially, I thought was interesting because we still have this idea, and I talked about this at the American Conservative Conference, is that we're still sizing our military to fight two major regional conflicts simultaneously. And they're just following Trump's, well, McMaster had his hands in it, and so did Mattis. We have to get ready for a big power competition again. So they're sizing our military to fight two big wars at the same time. And that strategy means that the Army has to have, dozens upon dozens of brigade combat teams, which are, 4,500 soldiers each. I'll do a quick screen share with the audience for the Heritage report that came out. You guys see that?
Yep.
You guys see it okay?
Yeah, looks
Okay.
good.
Yeah, so it's just based on historical force requirements, Heritage. So historical force means two big wars at the same time. The Army needs a total of 50 brigade combat teams in addition to active forces, blah, blah, blah. So only 15 brigade combat teams are considered ready. And right now they can field 31 brigade combat teams. And then an additional 19 brigade combat teams are needed to reach 50. So we have this idea, unfortunately, that we just need to have a big military and then that military will win. But as Bill has probably said, numerous times, May 1940, who had the better tanks? France did. Who was playing defense? France did. Who had a bigger military? France did. Who was playing defense? Who had 8 months to get ready for war? Who won that war? Well, that battle, it was over in 43 days. Why? Because the Germans had ideas that were revolutionary.
Well,
So
quantity does have a quality all its own.
mass is part of warfare. Yes, there's no getting around the fact that mass matters. But do we need 50 brigade combat teams? Well, and we can't even fill or make 16 of them ready. So that's just, and then all the other services are kind of the same way now, where the Air Force needs 100 B-21 bombers at $550 million apiece to fill out that strategy.
Well, the first thing you have to understand is that this, quote, strategy, unquote, is no such thing. It's simply purely arbitrary. that we have to be prepared to fight two major regional wars at the same time has been nonsense for decades. We could barely fight one regional war at a time, barely. And that was when we had a lot more stuff than we do now. Vietnam was one regional war against a minor power, and it took everything we had. Iraq was one regional war against a minor power. It took everything we had. So this is not a strategy for war. It's a budget strategy. Similarly, to try to translate that into how many brigade combat teams you need is just picking the number out of thin air. Are we fighting two regional wars against Russia and China, or against Luxembourg and Micronesia? Obviously, the number of brigade combat teams you need is not going to be the same for both. These are completely arbitrary numbers. They have nothing to do with reality. They are strictly there for budget justification. It's all bunk. And everybody in Washington knows it's bunk. This is just kabuki for the rubes out in flyover land.
And then the segue I wanted to use from that was, in addition to size, this past week they reported that they killed the leader of the planner of the USS Cole attack. He was killed in the article says a precision airstrike, and they're still assessing the results of it. And this is something I'd like Bill to talk about a little. When I read Victoria, you said there's no such thing as a precise weapon in a real war. There's no such thing as a precision weapon in a real war. And I think that in today's especially with the beginning with the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, there was this shock and awe, the stealths and using tomahawks, and then we did that on the second Iraq War. And I think a lot of people in the military, myself included, when we went in, we think that war is just like you push a button and then the enemy goes away, and it's that simple, and then we win, right? Well, we have the best weapons, and we're still not winning in Afghanistan, etc. And then when I was at TACP school to do a forward air controller tour, we learned a program called Piss Off, which is essentially a way for you to take a map chip, and then from that map chip, you can just pick a point on the map, and it's been commensurated, meaning you can pick any point on that map, and it's like a detailed view, and it gives you a category 1, meaning accurate to 0 to 6 meters, 10-digit grid that then guys would then load into a JDAM. And they talk about giving these briefs to generals before they go do a strike in Afghanistan. Hey, we're going to brief you 100 PowerPoint slides about doing a single solitary airstrike to kill some guy. But it's like, have we not? Can you just talk about the fallacy that there is such thing as a precision weapon in a real war?
Well, first of all, simply the ability to hit a target precisely is not new. Artillery has been able to do this for a long time. In the siege of Warsaw in 1944, when the infantry would tell the Stuka pilots, hit that building, some of the Stuka pilots would reply, which window? So we've been able to put ordnance pretty precisely on target for quite a long time. The problem, looking at the American military, is we reduce war simply to that. We reduce war to putting ordnance on targets. And this, of course, is the heart of second generation war, which we inherited from the French during and after World War I. The French doctrine summed itself up by saying firepower kills. It's an attritional approach to war, and it reduces it all to the physical level, and you win by accumulating these attrition scores through putting ordnance on targets. But war is vastly more complex than that, which is why we can't understand that we keep putting more ordnance on more targets and continue losing. Well, the reason is because you can't reduce war to that. Yeah. It's vastly more complicated. And when you are a country that has all these incredible technologies for putting ordnance on target, by the way, none of them are any better for doing that than the suicide bomber. That's the poor man's precision-guided weapon. Yeah. But when you're the superpower where your people are not only putting ordnance on all these targets, they're doing it from complete safety, you turn yourself into Goliath. Well, in the 3,000 or so years that the story of David and Goliath has been told, how many people have rooted for Goliath? You, on the moral level, you reinforce your enemies. Everybody wants the other guy to win because he's the poor guy, the little guy, the weak guy. This is Martin Van Creffel's The Power of Weakness. So we're winning, quote unquote, as we define it, we're blowing things up on the physical level of war while losing on the much more powerful moral level of war. And then we can't understand why in the end we lost.
Yeah, they disrespect us. It's kind of like, it's an insult because we're not willing to show our face to our enemy.
Yes, precisely. We're cowards.
Right.
I mean, this goes way back in war. This goes right back to the Iliad. What is Paris, the Trojan hero? He's an archer. He's a coward. He doesn't fight shield to shield and spear to spear like a Greek. So this goes back as far as you want to go in warfare. We don't get any of this because we reduce war to simply putting ordnance on target. And we will get better and better at putting ordnance on targets, and we will continue to lose, and we will not understand why. This actually ties in, Jeff, with something I wanted to bring up, which is that I'm getting feedback saying that even younger officers now are denying that we're heading toward the fourth generation, that the future is having to deal with these non-state opponents. And this is classic. This is classic of it's the knights in shining armor saying these low-born musketeers are just a passing fad. When an old generation of war is yielding to a new, it always tries to say, well, we're only going to fight the kinds of wars we want to fight. And so our military is saying, we're only going to fight Russia and China, who, of course, we're not going to fight because they're nuclear powers, unless we're very, very stupid. But what we're saying is our military, since it can't deal with fourth generation opponents, is simply going to pretend they don't exist, and we're going to give up trying. And that is a prescription for our military being so obsolete that it simply vanishes. And we've seen this historically over and over. In effect, our military at this point is a sort of mobile Maginot Line. It's already being bypassed. And it says, we're not going to worry about that. We're not even going to think about it. We're just going to, hey, do what Maginot Lines do. That we can do very well. Yeah, you can, but that's not where war is going.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw that firsthand in the Marines even up until the day I left. I mean, or if you want to talk about amphibious assault, like you mentioned, Marine Corps sells itself on the psalm from the sea that we're just going to put as many people as we can from the ships to the shore. That's our commercials. That's the Marine Corps' bread and butter. That's what we're going to be doing forever. Well, no, we're not going to be doing that, and it's stupid. But then in terms of the ground side, when we do integrated training exercise, our playbooks only call for fighting, on the offense, in the defense. And when we're in the defense, guess what's coming at our defense? 30 BMPs, in a column. Well, how do we deal with being attacked by 30 BMPs in a column? Like our quarterback, if we're a football team, no one's gone through the trouble of rewriting our plays because they only have one playbook and nobody wants to revise it. And so when we go to practice in our TNR, that's the only plays that we're running. So you're right. That I saw that firsthand, and you don't have an enemy to practice against unless it's a big time, superpower. And that's our only plays. So I completely agree.
So much of the American military identity comes from World War II propaganda. There was such good optics of Marines going ashore on D-Day, and every
Marines on D-Day.
Okay, well I don't actually remember or know
specifically. That was the Army.
Okay.
Normandy.
Right, yeah, I guess Marines were in the Pacific, right? So
yeah.
Still. The Marines themselves want to be doing that, and that's why so many join the Marines. That's what so many commanders in the Marines want to be doing, is being in control of an operation like that. And then the American identity comes from World War II propaganda as well, fighting the good war.
Right.
Yes, you're absolutely right, Brent. We are locked in to a vision of war that essentially remains a World War II vision. That's correct. And we didn't even get that World War II on the Eastern Front was fought very differently. In other words, we didn't get operational maneuver. We still don't. Our Army now has the term, but it doesn't know what it means, and it can't do it. So it's actually only our own experience in World War II that we look back to. And this, again, historically is something we've seen over and over and over again. The armies of 1914 looked very much like the armies of 1814, and they went off trying to fight very much like the armies of 1814. And the result, of course, was absolute catastrophe for everybody. This is a normal phenomenon, and we're caught up in it to the point where I just read the latest Marine Corps Gazette, and the Marine Corps' latest concept is essentially going back to preparing for a campaign of taking islands in the Pacific. I assume that the Imperial Japanese Navy is now rising to the surface from its watery graves. And the real irony is we're thinking we're going to have to be taking back Japanese islands for the Japanese when they lose them to the Chinese. Yeah. So it's gone beyond the point of tragedy. It's at this point, it's farce.
It's a funny story on that one. Recently, a Marine general, I think he was in, I can't remember what command, but he's in the Pacific, but he said they were talking about the Chinese, reconquering these islands and the island issues, the Spratlys, et cetera. And the Marine general said, I'm paraphrasing, I just want to let everyone know that the Marine Corps has a lot of first-hand experience with retaking islands. But then you look at these islands on a map or on Wikipedia, they're nothing more than a rock protruding from the top they're like 0.5 miles square wide. Like, these things are rocks. It's not Iwo Jima, it's not Okinawa, but that's another story. But Bill, if you're saying that today's military is a farce because we're playing for the old games, do we need to change our equipment, or we just need to change, we don't need to so much change the equipment that we have, we just need to change the ideas that we're using and how we're going to fight? Should the military be preparing to fight two kind of different playbooks? Should they be preparing to fight a Hama model, fourth generation, where we just crush them until they give up, and then also be trained to fight, fourth generation de-escalation style? Is that what needs to happen? What needs to happen to make our military fourth generation capable?
Well, what you need is the Hama model, this is taken from Van Crefeld, is essentially extreme violence executed in a very short time frame. And that's easy for us to do. That's putting firepower on targets. The thing we can't do is the de-escalation model, which is generally what you have in a fourth generation situation. Which, by the way, is why you don't want to get into those kinds of wars, because it takes forever and it's very expensive. And it generally isn't worth it.
Jeff, we're getting a lot of feedback from your end. There we go.
I think something is. I think
you're good. Go ahead, Bill.
Go ahead, Bill. I think you're good.
But it is not a situation. Let me put it this way: navies and air forces are very equipment driven. You can change them dramatically by changing the kind of equipment you give them. That is not true of ground forces. And so if we're looking at the Army and the Marine Corps, the changes we need there are in terms of internal organizational culture, and doctrine. And that's, of course, what the military reform movement has been trying to promote since the 1970s. And we continue to be locked into this. It's really even more of a World War I paradigm, if you want, rather than World War II. The second generation of modern war comes out of World War I, as does the third. But we've stuck in the second, which is the French approach. The third generation is the German approach that also comes out of World War I. Blitzkrieg is conceptually complete by 1918. So when we're looking at the ground services, fundamentally we need to change ideas, not equipment.
Yeah, if the Marines want to do the island hopping campaign, they're going to have to get battleships out of mothball in order to do that.
They're also going to have to find a way to not be vaporized by nuclear weapons. Which is
I think the strength during World War I, was the fact that we started with nothing and built what we needed.
The strength we had in World War II is that we had 500 Soviet divisions, occupying most of the German army's attention.
Sure, sure.
Americans tend to forget about that. We think of World War II as the United States and Britain against Germany and Japan.
Right, right.
It's a little more complicated than that. The country that won the war for the Allies was Stalin's Soviet Union.
Well, it might have been Hitler, actually. But
Well,
he should never have declared war on the United States.
He should never have declared war on the Soviet Union or the
Yeah.
United States. No, he greatly overestimated Germany's industrial capacity, among other things. But our World War II army and our army today is largely a copy of the French army of the interwar years.
Okay.
And that's the model we adopted. We forgot where it came from, so that when the French army went down in 6 weeks in 1940, we didn't get it.
Right, yeah.
We didn't understand what that meant for us because we'd forgotten that we'd gotten what we think of as the American way of war from the French.
Right.
But that's where we still are today.
But I guess from a standpoint, I was just kind of like thinking about Jeff's question of how do you prepare for both? It's almost like you have to wait to see what you need before you can really diagnose a cure for something if you don't know what you're trying to cure or the problems that you might have. That becomes a tough balance to strike.
It is always true that however you've prepared for war, when war comes, the side that's going to win is probably the one that can get over its mistakes and adjust fastest.
Right.
Because
For
all
sure.
of them make mistakes beforehand, trying to guess what the nature of the next war will be like.
Right.
But we're at this point so far behind. I mean, we're literally a century behind, that we're stuck in the second generation while war is moving into the fourth. It's bad enough to be one generation behind. Being 2 generations behind, you've got a problem.
Definitely.
When it comes to equipment, a pet theory of mine regarding the aviation component is that, what if there was some actual like real pressure put on our war-making capability, we'd see a lot of the equipment that we use for aerial combat change drastically, because we've developed these super high complex machines that are, very maintenance intensive. The components they use exotic materials, are hard to produce, they're extremely expensive. And if we were using lots of them in a protracted conflict, we'd see probably the scale of technology come down quite a bit. The actual effective use of military aviation is about, putting guns on enemy infantry, not about having spectacular aerial dogfights between, 2 jet fighters.
Right. It's hard to stomach
Fast-moving jet fighters actually aren't even that useful in real war.
Well, as we've seen, war is changing in ways that simply makes all of that equipment irrelevant. I mean, how many American pilots have made ace against the Taliban? Okay.
Right.
Flying carpets.
Yes, they're flying carpets outmaneuver us every time. So, yes, all of this stuff essentially is for yesterday's war, and for more than anything for just justifying budgets. If you actually were designing airplanes for combat, they'd be like the A-10. They'd be designed to be simple, robust, easily maintained, can generate a lot of sorties per day, not one sortie per day, or with some of ours now, maybe one sortie every few days, if you're lucky. But it's very similar to the fact that the knight's armor reached its technical perfection and its most expensive state just before the knight disappeared altogether. And that's right where we are now with all of this high tech, the fighters, the cruisers, even the tanks. All of this stuff is reaching this state of almost Baroque complexity and technical perfection just before it vanishes completely.
Brent, you had linked me an article a while back about the Air Force and the fact that the problem also is that we're not able to stomach losses, because if we lose, if you lose a plane we're losing billions of dollars of plane, not just millions of dollars. So that's another problem we run into, is just the sheer cost of the losses that we would take, would be able to recover.
The first goose that flies into the engine of a B-2 and brings it down will truly be the golden goose. Yes, because it will have taken out $2 billion at a stroke.
It's an expensive goose.
Indeed. I got a call from a friend whose brother-in-law's brother-in-law's brother was in an F-35 that went down. The guy got out, fortunately. But I said, just tell him he's one of the few people his age to have spent over $100 million.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Let me switch a little bit to a remarkable statement here on the front page of yesterday's, that's Saturday, January 5th, New York Times. This at a time, of course, when it's very clear the Democrats, who now control the House, are never going to fund any serious border barrier, call it what you will, a wall, a fence, what have you. And again, this is astounding from the New York Times. It writes, the shelter network here, we're talking El Paso, run by the nonprofit Annunciation House, is now receiving roughly 200 new migrants a day, the same number it saw in an entire week only a year ago. The number of migrants traveling as families crossing the border from Mexico exceeded 25,000 in November, the highest numbers ever recorded. And I'm quoting, again, believe it or not, the New York Times. A crisis of the kind President Trump has long warned of is beginning to take shape along the country's 1,900-mile border with Mexico.
Gasp.
Yes, the front page of the New York Times is saying the president is right.
I won't drink too much from the New York Times.
No, yes, I mean, I'm sure the editor who let this get through has been fired and so on. But somehow the New York Times printed news that doesn't fit its usual line. And of course, this is exactly what's happening. As I've said before, this is just the beginnings of what is going to be a massive move of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of people south to north in the remainder of this century. And we're going to need a lot more than a wall, but a wall is a good starting point. And yet the Democrats are making it absolutely clear you won't get a dime. The reason for this is the Democrats' strategy, which they've been very public about for years, is to swamp the votes of native-born Americans in the votes of a sea of immigrants. And
they're making a lot of progress there.
Yes, I mean, so of course they're looking at this and saying, hallelujah, you know, how do we sign these people up to vote? How quickly can we get them naturalized as citizens? These people are how we're going to take power. Now, as I've said before, it may not work that way, because they're assuming that all the people in their politically correct victims groups all love each other and all going to vote as a bloc. Well, no, it doesn't necessarily work that way. But the reason why they won't do anything to protect the southern border is because this is their strategy. What I'm hearing is that the president, of course, knows he's never going to get funding from the Democratic House on this, that he's for a while going to continue to make the point that it's the Democrats who will not protect the border, and then he's simply going to act. He's going to move 10 to 15,000 troops to the border, and he's going to take most, if not all, of the military construction budget and use it to build, again, a wall, a fence, call it what you will, but a physical barrier that they will find difficulty getting over. And the New York Times itself makes it clear we've got to have this.
So, I mean, Trump has to get this wall built. He's got some strategies he can use. It seems like he's weighing the option as to whether or not he's going to declare a national emergency and use emergency powers to get a wall built. If he doesn't get it built, he's not getting reelected, is my opinion.
I think that's probably correct, and I think that is also his judgment. So what the Democrats are going to do, of course, they're saying anytime the president makes a move like that, we're going to consider it grounds for impeachment. Well, I'm sure the president is realistic enough to know Of course, the House is going to impeach him over the next 2 years. It has to satisfy its political base. The Democrats want to be not too obvious that this is purely a political move. They want to try to cloak it in investigations and legal charges and so forth. But it's purely political, and they have to do it because their base demands it. Of course, he's not going to get convicted by the Senate. But we all know where this is going. I think the president knows perfectly well where it's going. There's no reason he should hesitate to act because he might get impeached, because he's going to get impeached. And as long as he isn't convicted, impeachment itself doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Okay. Bill, did you have anything else that you wanted to discuss?
No, that essentially, the miracle of the New York Times telling the truth, yes, was such a breathtaking event in and of itself that I thought that one item tonight was plenty.
All right. The last bit I want to talk about was Tucker Carlson had a monologue over the past couple of days, a day or 2 or 3 days ago. He's, of course, a commentator on Fox News, so I thought this was particularly interesting that somebody in the mainstream is taking a lot of our alt-right, if you will, or paleo-conservative, real conservative talking points and delivering them to millions of people. So he had a good monologue, and I pulled out a couple points that I'll just read off. I'm kind of paraphrasing in a lot of them. Let's see. It says, for generations, Republicans have considered it their duty to make the world safe for banking while prosecuting ever more foreign wars. And generally, Democrats are also in support of these policies. Anyone that thinks the health of a nation can be summed up in GDP is an idiot. Wages have increased for women more than men in many areas. And when women make more money than men, they don't want to marry the men. And this leads to lower marriage rates, increased drug and alcohol abuse, low birth rates, out of wedlock births, depression and suicide. We talked about the immorality of usury. Says that the free market, that free market exploitative capitalism is immoral. Talked about how the rich are taxed at a ridiculously and unfairly low rate compared to middle-class labor hour tax rates. Market capitalism is a tool not to be worshipped. And then he distinguishes from criticizing capitalism and also saying that we don't have to be socialists either.
That's correct.
And summed it up by saying that if you want to put America first, you have to put its families first. And this would just be untouchable by any other conservative or quote unquote conservative in the mainstream. And it's just amazing that our talking points are finally getting out there.
Well, and we do have to admire his courage, because I'm sure he is going to pay a heavy price for having committed truth, which in Washington is the ultimate sin, on a variety of issues like this. But of course, he's correct right across the board. Both parties are now part of the permanent war state. Untrammeled, unregulated market capitalism results in a very tiny, super rich elite, and everybody else is poor. Socialism just makes everybody poor, so that's not necessarily an improvement, but there are other alternatives, including mercantilism, which is generally where I come down, which is the 17th and 18th century economic philosophy that was free market, but it was a regulated free market, and the government was very concerned with things like providing jobs, import substitution, running a positive balance of trade, making sure that the money was real, i.e. gold and silver. These are the kind of policies that worked very well when we were transforming ourselves from a wilderness populated by a few million howling savages into a modern industrial power. We forget that the Republican Party during that period was the party of high tariffs. So yes, he's committed truth on a number of issues, and I'm sure all of the powers that be in the so-called conservative movement which is conservative only in name, most of it, are howling at him for it. But yeah, he's right.
Yeah. Profits over people.
Oh, definitely. Jeff, have you gotten your scheme on?
Jess, your mic is still really, really screwed up.
No, Jeff seems to, Jeff's boilers are blown up. So we don't seem to be able to talk much to him tonight. In any case, I think that what Tucker Carlson said, you're going to hear more and more people saying as they begin to recognize the reality that if the Democrats aren't fools, and they will be fools, but if they aren't fools, and nominate a white guy in a suit in 2020 who runs on the issue of economic inequality, with the middle class getting steadily poorer while a very tiny elite gets fantastically rich, the Democrats are probably going to win with that message. And conservatives need to remind themselves that what we want is a country where virtually everybody is middle class, both economically and in terms of their values and the way they live.
Yep.
What's amazing is that Trump won the presidency on that message, and there's so few other Republicans that are willing to take that line, pick it up, and run with it. They still want to go back to the regular old free market talking points.
Because that's where the money is.
I mean, how much money is there if you lose elections? I mean, if you have no prospect of getting power, well, I understand.
They get money even if they lose, exactly. Republicans don't have any great desire to win. That's one of their strange characteristics. Democrats do. But Republicans just want to have the money rolling in and be in important positions where everyone has to bow and scrape to them, and they're surrounded by adoring flunkies and so on, and they retire from Washington very, very wealthy. Winning isn't terribly high on their priority list because in many ways they don't really want to govern.
Yeah, they're there for a paycheck.
Yeah. So there's the gulf between the people who elected Trump and establishment Republicans just gets wider all the time.
Yeah, I don't see anything really happening until everyone has to change. That's
Which
really
will come
probably,
with the economic collapse that will come with the debt crisis. Exactly.
So that is the last news item I've got. Bill, do you want to talk about your books?
I want to mention again, for those who realize that fourth generation war, war with and war between non-state forces, in fact, is the coming way. The book that Greg Thiel and I have published on that, Fourth Generation Warfare Handbook, is perhaps of some use. And then the fourth generation war that really matters is the kind that occurs in your own country, and that is Thomas Hobbes' novel Victoria, for which I'm happy to be the agent. And it is the story set 50 years in the future of fourth generation war here in North America. It is a warning. This is not a future that we want, but it's the course that we're on at the moment. No question about it.
And Retroculture, when's that coming out?
Retroculture is coming out sometime this quarter. This is the book that is designed to create a movement that can get us onto a different course, a course where we revive the old ways that worked. Essentially, the culture that's created by the Victorians and that is the culture of the vast majority of Americans up through the 1950s. It was a very functional culture. It gave us a very nice country, and it can be brought back. We know from that experience what works, and we know from our experience from the 60s onward what doesn't work. So retroculture is essentially designed to create a movement where we go back to what works.
Before we sign off, we've got a couple questions from the live chat. Reminder, if you want to interact with the show, just comment live in the live chat. We can read some of the comments. We'll read your questions. You can also send questions to traditionalright@gmail.com, or you can go to traditionalright.com and go to our About page, and you can go through the email function there and send us a message. So first question I've got is from James Waterman. Do you think the wars of the next 50 years will be similar to the wars of the 1700s, in particular when tribes of nations, Europeans/Indians, warred against each other for control of North America?
No, because at that time, the European armies could virtually be certain of victory. There were occasional battles where they lost, Isandlwana, the Little Bighorn, but they knew that in the end they were going to win, that the European way of war was superior to any and all native ways of war. That is no longer the case. We're now finding that the fourth generation non-state forces are able to stand effectively against modern state armies. And that's a big change from the situation in the 17th and 18th centuries.
Another one from J.E. Knowles. What are the best 4GW propaganda techniques?
That varies greatly according to the situation. And it all proceeds from an understanding that all good propagandists have, that the most effective propaganda is true. It's not lies. The most effective propaganda is true. And it's what you do, not what you say. What you do is always much more powerful than what you say. So if we think of propaganda in that very broad sense, the most effective are the organizations like Hezbollah, which provide a wide variety of services to the people in the areas they control. Services that, in theory, the state is supposed to provide, but the state, for reasons of corruption, incompetence, what have you, no longer provides or doesn't provide very well. So that is far and away the most effective propaganda. And particularly when these non-state organizations can provide order in places where the state no longer can. That's propaganda in what coming out of what you do, not just what you say, and that's always the most effective.
For a situation where there is no like violent conflict that has opened up, isn't propaganda really the weapon of choice? Because you can expose your enemy for whatever they're doing at really no personal risk?
Again, if you're thinking of it from the fourth generation organization or entity standpoint, the most effective propaganda is to point to the failures of the state to do what it's supposed to do, beginning with providing order, safety of persons and property. And of course, pointing out the corruption of the state, pointing out that the people who, as in Washington today, have access to power, also for some strange reason seem to get remarkably wealthy despite moderate salaries. It's pointing out, and John Boyd talked about this a lot, the gaps between what your opponent, the state, does and what it says. And as those gaps get wider and wider, the credibility of the non-state and anti-state forces grows. But at a certain point, when the state becomes sufficiently weak that those non-state forces can start to actually take over in areas, then they have to provide those services. If they don't, then they will quickly lose their legitimacy, just as the state lost its legitimacy for the same reason.
I'm thinking of how we can possibly try to resist, like in America, we want to resist our ethnic replacement, the replacement of our traditions, our way of life. Propaganda seems like the best way to do that, just by, talking about what the establishment is doing to us, so on and so forth. What is the next step there? Because we don't want to create a situation of disorder in our country, but at the same time, it seems like this situation is kind of intolerable, or getting to that point.
Well, I think that, again, the answer there is retroculture. We remind people that when virtually all Americans, black, white, immigrants, native-born, everybody, followed traditional middle-class values, which come primarily out of England in the 18th century. They really get started in many ways in the Netherlands in the 17th century, but because we were settled primarily from England, that's where our public culture came from. It was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, quite irrespective of whether you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or not. The culture that you followed, at least in the public square, was WASP culture, and it worked. And it worked for everybody, not just for the WASPs. We go back to the black inner city of the 1950s. It was a safe place. 80% of black school children came home to married mothers and fathers. The problems in black schools were the same as the problems in white schools, running in the halls and talking in class. Those were middle-class people. They may have been poor, but the values by which they lived were middle class. And again, those are white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in origin for this country. When we remind people of that and remind them that that worked, as all around them they see more and more things not working, I think that's not just propaganda, it's pointing out an alternate course to the one we're currently on.
Do you think people need more, because I guess the overall, I guess utopia, that's the wrong word, but the goal, the Victoria, or the image, or the, I guess, vision you have, that's kind of goal oriented. I guess, what steps can we take as individuals to get towards that goal? I think that's what people are looking for.
And that's exactly what my book Retroculture is about.
Right.
It looks at all kinds of ways that you and your family can return to the old ways of doing things in virtually every aspect of your life. So,
so a good step too would be to get together with people of like mind.
Exactly,
Talk about
and that's very much part of the Retroculture book. Again, its goal is to create a movement, and a movement is where people don't do this on their own and in their own families, but they start getting together, and that's very much laid out in the book. So the basic answer to the question is retroculture. And I hope we will soon have the book itself right here on our show to talk about.
Excellent. I've read it. I've read the manuscript. I'm looking forward to going through the final published copy again. I'm excited about that. Jeff, I want to give you a chance to try to plug your book. I think you put on some headphones, so maybe we won't get so much feedback.
Yeah, can you guys hear me a little better now or no?
Yes.
That is way better.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I got headphones on now. Yeah, so my book actually ties into kind of what Tucker Carlson was talking about on his show, is that, you know, our society has been taught that the only point of our life on earth and the only reason we should exist is just to be happy. And Tucker Carlson talks about that on the shows, you know. Is really this free market, quote unquote, capitalism, is that the only thing that we should be striving for? And he now sees that split in the right conservative movement in this country, where yes, we've always been of one mind and of one, you know, ideology in terms of social values, but there is this split that he's witnessed, and I think he's taken the right side, where we'll know, like, the point of our lives just shouldn't be accumulation of wealth and physical possessions. And he sees all these different bad things that are happening. And I spoke on the last podcast about, you know, Solzhenitsyn and how his speech to our country really resonated with me. And the intro quote to my book is from Solzhenitsyn's speech, and he said, when he spoke to Harvard in 1978, he said at the end, you know, he said, if humanism was right, humanism meaning this ideology that gave us communism and, for a lot of ways, free market capitalism too. If humanism was right, that man was only born to be happy, he would not be born to die. Because our bodies are doomed to death, the task on earth must be of an evidently more spiritual nature. It can't be unrestrained enjoyment of everyday life. It can't be the best ways to find material goods, cheerfully get the most of them. It has to be a permanent, earnest duty to become a better moral person before you die. And so to what John was saying, how do we find these things again? Well, the tide's beginning to turn because we're starting to get the feedback from decades of living the wrong way. And when that tide finally comes, we need to be ready to, go back to the old ways of living. And the last point I'll make, so that's the plug for my book. It's the theme throughout my book is, we need to return. We've lost something. I don't prescribe anything new. I'm just talking about problems. Bill's book is about what we can do new. But to jump back just for a second to Tucker Carlson, I think it's funny when people talk about free market capitalism. We say free markets. One of the books I read that blew my mind was James Burnham's book, The Managerial Revolution. Have you guys, Bill, if you've maybe heard of it, but he said that free market capitalism died in 1940 with the fall of France. True laissez-faire capitalism was no longer once France fell, and since then, after fascism fell and then communism fell, it's been a U.S. global order of a race to the bottom, with corporations pairing with governments and enforcing laws that way. It's not truly free market. And I think Tucker Carlson realizes that. And like Frank said, I'm glad that he is coming out swinging on the right side of, I think, the way things are going.
Well, yeah, there's never been, and never will be in the real world, libertarians to the contrary, a pure free market capitalism. What we had was a regulated market, but it was a wisely regulated market, and much of the economy everywhere was local. And one of the big issues on economics that conservatives should address, real conservatives, is the problem of size and scale. It's not just big government that's a threat to us, it's big anything. And if we're going to talk about how we recover the prosperity that we had in the past, the middle class prosperity, we have to talk about life becoming local again, where a great deal of what we buy, a great deal of what we consume, a great deal of furniture in our houses and so forth is local in origin. And the financing for it is local, through local banks. The issue of scale is going to be one of the big issues, in my view, in politics over the next few decades. And conservatives need to be on the right side of that issue. And the right side of that issue is not lining up with the international mega corporations that could care less whether they're employing somebody in the United States or Pago. They only care about their profits. We need to get back to an economy where scale is small enough that life is lived locally.
And I think liberals would agree with you on that one. That sounded like a very quote unquote liberal statement in today's time, but liberals would agree with you. Local is better.
They do until you start talking about government. And then, of course, the bigger the better. We want everything to be local.
Yeah, small is beautiful, Schumacher.
Right.
There's a lot of things we can agree with liberals on, or things that are thought of in common discourse as liberal or leftist, but like we want a healthy environment. We want a locally focused life. We want to ensure the health of our communities. We would like to see a national rail system. I think there's a lot that we can work together on.
We can work with liberals. Working with cultural Marxists is a different story.
Yeah. Anywho, that is all we've got for tonight. So thanks for tuning in, everyone. Remember, if you have questions or comments, put them in the live chat, send them to traditionalright@gmail.com, and we'll read them on the air. So have a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.